Welcome to the Motivated Martial Arts Podcast. Your hosts, Jackson White and Gavin Cook, have been friends and Tae Kwon Do training partners for over 40 years. This podcast will bring you a mixture of their life stories, martial arts, and business experiences to motivate you in life and throughout your martial arts journey. Adding in a mixture of inspiring interviews and some of the best traditional martial artists around today. So over to your hosts, the Motivated Martial Artists.
Welcome to the Motivated Martial Artists Podcast with me, Gavin Cook.
And me, Jackson White.
And this morning we're going to be chatting to a very highly motivated young lady who is a pioneer in the mixed martial arts world, one of the first ladies to be involved with MMA in the Cage Warrior and the UFC. Not only is she a mixed martial arts fighter, she's also a mathematician, she's an athlete, she's an osteopath, she's a writer and a musician, politician. So a very, very interesting young lady. So without further ado, we're going to pass you over to Rosi Sexton. Hello, Rosi.
Hello. It's good to be here.
Good morning, Rosi.
Good to have you on this morning, Rosi.
So what I'd like to do is kick off with our first question. We'd really like to get a bit of an insight into your early life, childhood and schooling, and really how you got involved in martial arts.
So I was your stereotypical nerdy kid at school. I was quite anxious, didn't have a large group of friends, you know, I sort of always had a couple of people I gravitated towards, but I spent a lot of time doing my own thing in the library, head buried in a textbook, that sort of thing. Never very sporty until somebody dropped a leaflet for the local taekwondo club through my door. And in fact, I think it was my brother who started going first, and he went to a few lessons. And for some reason, I decided that I wanted to give it a go. And I'm not sure exactly what was going through my head at the time. I think I had this general idea that I wanted to learn a bit of self-defense, wanted to know what to do in a physical confrontation. I think it was something like that. I was about 14 at the time. So I went along, and really, for the first time, I found a physical activity that I really enjoyed, and I loved it. I absolutely fell in love with it, and things sort of developed from there. You know, I went from going once a week to going 2-3 times a week, and I did that throughout the rest of sort of my schooling, and it was when I went to university that I started to get involved in a few other martial arts as well, and it all developed from there. But yeah, so Taekwondo was my first introduction to the world of martial arts, and I was dreadful at first. I was absolutely terrible at it. It was, I think my first instructor, I later on many years later, found out that he'd described me as a sweet, innocent 14-year-old girl who couldn't punch her way out of a wet paper bag. Okay. And that was quite accurate. It was no bones about it at all.
It was interesting that you said you didn't take to any sort of sports at school, but then you found your way with martial arts. Do you think that was because it was more of an individual martial art, and maybe you didn't fit with the team stuff, or how would you think that came about?
I think that's definitely one factor. The fact it's an individual, and I think as well it's the idea that you progress at your own pace.
Yes.
So with sport at school, it always felt like you just got thrown in at the deep end, and you were either good at it or you weren't. But there wasn't much of a progression. People didn't take you and say, right, well, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. Here's how we get you from A to B. There didn't seem to be any of that. And it was only really after I started doing martial arts that I realised that actually that's how all physical activities should be taught. And I mean, in the same way that when we teach kids maths, we don't just give them a set of really hard problems and then shout at them for not being able to do it. You build up gradually from what they're able to do, and you introduce the new concepts one at a time. And there's absolutely no reason we shouldn't be doing the same thing with physical activities as well. And I mean, I would hope that things are a little better these days, at least. I mean, this was 30 years ago, so it's. I'm hoping that things have improved, but possibly not as much as we'd like them to.
I think particularly in education, it's a harder task, isn't it? Because you've got such large groups.
Yeah.
You've got to cater.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think across the curriculum. We see that in all subjects. I think it's certainly the idea of physical training being something that you can improve at. And again, I remember when I was in primary school, there was this idea that you're either good at sport or you weren't.
Yeah.
And if you were, then you'd be on all the teams and everything like that. And if you weren't, well, you just tried not to embarrass yourself too badly. And that's something, it was only when I discovered martial arts that I realized it didn't have to be like that. And that actually there are ways of improving on all of these things, all of the skills, even your fitness, your strength, various attributes, speed. They're all things that can be trained with the right approach. And sort of over the years, I suppose my journey through martial arts has been a process of discovering that, and that actually, physical skills are no different from learning to play a musical instrument or learning maths or any other school subject.
It's a process.
Yes.
It's a journey, isn't it? And I think that's key, understanding that journey. I think martial arts gives you that journey with the small achievable goals.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think that was exactly it. It was breaking it down into things that, and I mean, there were aspects of Taekwondo that I was better at. There were aspects that I was not so good at. I always took quite naturally to learning moves and patterns and things. Sparring, that was always more challenging for me. So, but within that, I think being able to focus on your strengths and at the same time develop your weaknesses, that was something that, again, it started to make much more sense through martial arts.
Okay, so how old were you when you achieved your first black belt in a martial art then?
So I think I was 17 when I got my Taekwondo black belt. So it was just before I went to university.
Okay, and what type of Taekwondo? Was it ITF, WT?
It was ITF. I was with UKTA.
Yeah, that's who we started with originally back in the 80s, wasn't it, Jackson?
70s for me.
70s.
Okay.
Yeah. So this would have been let me think. It would have been early 90s, I think.
And then you moved from Taekwondo, and then you got your black belt in some other disciplines, I understand. So what other disciplines did you study?
Yes. So when I went to university, there was obviously a whole range of different martial arts on offer. I wanted to take the opportunity to expand so I decided to do some grappling, and I found it was a traditional jiu-jitsu club that I started out in. So it's quite self-defense focused, and that was the next thing that I really concentrated on. So I did that for, I'm just trying to think, 5-6 years, something like that, and I got to black belt in that. And that was around the time when I saw a documentary about mixed martial arts. And this was sort of my first real awareness of mixed martial arts as a sport. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, that's something I want to have a go at.
Okay.
And I think for me, the idea was that it was a personal challenge. It was something that I wanted to prove to myself I could do it. And I suppose all along with martial arts, that was what I'd wanted to get to, was that feeling of knowing that if I got into a fight, I would know what to do. I'd be able to not necessarily win, but to use what I'd learned in a useful way. And I think the thing that I always struggled with across my various different martial arts was worrying that, okay, well, this is okay, it's sparring, but if it was a real situation, would I be able to make this work, or would I just freeze? And I think there was always that sort of question at the back of my mind. So that's one of the things when I saw the idea of mixed martial arts. And when that first appeared, the idea is very much testing yourself and your style against other people from different arts or different training backgrounds. That was how mixed martial arts had developed. So for me, that was a reasonably natural progression, I suppose. Anyhow, when I started looking into it, I discovered that there were clubs that trained for this kind of competition. So I started getting involved in that a little bit. And eventually in 2002, I think it was, I had my first mixed martial arts fight.
Wow. So who was what MMA camp did you join to obviously get trained up for that?
So I was in Manchester at the time, and I found a small club. It was called Defence Unlimited at the time. That's since developed, and obviously things move on and people move on. I started out by doing a few small grappling competitions, and it sort of developed from there. I mean, at the time there was really no women's mixed martial arts at all in the UK. Yeah. There's very little anywhere in the world. When I first saw sort of the opportunity to compete, it was somebody had posted on a forum somewhere asking for an opponent for a woman who was competing. Yeah. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, that's an opportunity. So I called the guy up, I found out a little bit about it. But by the time I'd called him, they'd found somebody else to take that slot. So I went away, didn't really think any more of it. I hadn't been training for it particularly. Then the day before the event, he called me back and said, our opponent's dropped out. Do you want to do it?
Right, brilliant.
And this was absolutely nuts. It was crazy because I hadn't been training for it. I'd never fought full contact in my life. I'd done I'd done lots of semi-contact. I'd done some sport jujutsu. Yeah. I'd done some grappling competitions. But this was definitely a step up, and it wasn't something that I prepared for.
Jiu-jitsu, the grappling side in the ITF Tae Kwon Do, the semi-contact, you're getting hit, but actually you can always step out the ring, or the referee's there to protect you.
It's things are a bit different. So at the same time, I saw this as an opportunity because it was one of those where if I don't take this, I'm not sure when the next opportunity is going to come round. Because again, it's not something that was going on all the time. So in the end, just decided to take that leap of faith and to go for it. And I ended up winning by armbar.
Just before you get onto the fight, Rosie, could you just talk us a little bit about how was your mindset at that time? It must have been quite a daunting, sort of waiting to go into the cage for the first time, and having never really been in the full contact arena before. Talk us a little bit about your thought process before you went in there. How are you feeling, and what did you do to sort of control those nerves and that anxiousness?
So I think, in a way, it was almost good that it happened so quickly because I didn't really have time to get properly nervous about it.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think also sort of not really knowing what to expect. It was all a bit of a blur because, as I say, it was literally sort of 36 hours before the event that I got the phone call. So it was all a question of running around trying to organise how am I going to get there, what am I going to wear, what's going on, and just get through the practical steps, that I didn't really have time to think about it too much, which in hindsight I think was probably quite a good thing. I didn't know anything at all about the opponent. I knew she was a little bit heavier than me, nothing at all about her background, so I couldn't overthink that. It was just a question of, right, well, let's do this. At the time, again, this was one of the very early events. It wasn't in a cage. It was just an open mat area. Okay. So it was. This was back in the days when the mixed martial arts scene was really quite different from what you see today. Yeah. It wasn't anywhere near as. Nowadays mixed martial arts has evolved into a sport in its own right. I think back in those days we were still at the point where this was people from different styles competing against each other. And sort of with a general sort of set of rules. The idea was not to favour one style particularly over others, but there was inconsistency in rules from one event to another. You didn't have clear weight classes, especially for women. It was sort of finding somebody who's more or less your size, give or take a bit. So it wasn't anywhere near as organised as things are nowadays. But it was an opportunity, and I wanted to take that opportunity. So you had to fight, and talk us a little bit about what happened in the fight then. So obviously, with you being a
a Taekwondo practitioner and jujutsu. How did the fight go? I presume it started as a standing fight. Did it quickly go to the ground, or what's your sort of recollection on
so? I remember getting punched in the head really quite hard a few times, and that was a bit of a wake up for me because, again, it's when you're used to doing semi-contact, it's not quite the same. And I remember getting hold of her, getting her to the ground. I think the referee ended up standing us back up. We did it again. I got it to the ground and eventually got the armbar. So, I mean, it was all a bit of a blur. I think it lasted about 3.5 minutes altogether. But yeah, no, I remember after that fight, I didn't feel so much elation or, it was just relief. It was, I've done it. I think it was the feeling of having done that, having sort of come out the other side, if you like. The fact that I won was a nice bonus. But it was more about, for me, it was more about the challenge of getting in there, I think. And that's the point when I started thinking, I wonder if I could get good at this.
So what was the next step then? Was it, I presume that you thought, right, I'm gonna train for this and I want to continue doing MMA. What sort of happened next on the journey? So
from there, I had a few more fights in the UK. I mean, Cage Warriors, which is now one of the well-known promotions, I fought on their very first event, and they decided that they were going to take a risk and put a women's fight on. And this was back in the day when everyone was going, "Oh, women shouldn't be fighting. It's unladylike. There was a real debate over whether women should be doing this at all, which, again, looking back from where we are now, seems crazy. In those 20 years, we've come a hell of a long way. And I keep reminding people of this because now people are complaining that, women aren't getting paid as much as the guys and this and that. And actually, I mean, there are legitimate things that we should be working towards. We're not there yet. But when I remind people, actually, look at how far we've come in that time and look at where we were, when there was a time when, I get invited on radio shows and people would legitimately ask me, "Oh, do you think, what would you say to people who say women shouldn't be doing this?" So yeah, so that was, it was definitely more of a barrier to overcome than it is nowadays.
Moving on to the next fight then, Rosie, where was that happen then? How did that happen?
So that was the one that was on the first Cage Warriors event. So that's right. That's where we were going. So this was on the first Cage Warriors event. They decided that they were going to take a risk with that and have a women's fight on the show. That one I had a bit more notice for, so I could prepare. And again, that was another win by armbar.
Okay, so, you like the armbars then? Yeah.
And I mean, this was that event. That was the first time I'd actually stepped in a cage. So, and I remember clearly, actually, when I first stepped in there, and that door closes, and there's a sense of, oh shit, what have I got myself into?
I can't get off this mat.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really different feeling. It's a really different feeling that first time. I mean, again, sort of over time, you get acclimatized to that. So, especially, at the higher levels when you're training in that setting all the time. But again, this was the very first time I'd never been in a cage, even in training. I mean, you didn't have these days. A lot of clubs have their own training cage to work in. Back in 2002, I mean, there were very few events that were being held in a cage, never mind clubs that had their own. So yes, that was that.
You were just training on the mats all the time, wasn't you?
Yes.
I'm sure going from training on the mat with maybe 10 other people that are all working on the same drill together. Next thing, being locked in a cage on your own.
Yeah, and I mean, like I say, that was, for that to be the very first time you stepped in a cage. And I mean, I think these days most people, when they're training, they'll have some exposure to that. So it's perhaps not so common for the very first time somebody experiences that to be their first, to be a fight. But yeah, so that was like I said, I definitely remember that feeling very clearly. And then
when you've got lots of new experiences flooding through you all at once, obviously with training, the aim is to eliminate as many of those new experiences. I think the one experience I'll always remember, we're doing my first full contact fight, getting into the ring, and I couldn't stop my leg from shaking. But as soon as you touch gloves, all those fears, all those nerves have gone completely. But I always remember, why is my leg still shaking? It's weird.
And that's an interesting thing, because I mean, I always got really nervous in the build up to a fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Once you get in, then you get going, and there's that when you touch gloves, game on. Yeah. From there, everything changes.
Someone's switching inside you, and you're in the zone, and you're focused.
But you're right. Well, it's weird, though, isn't it? Because when you look back on your fight, you can't often remember what you did, can you? People say, "Oh yeah, you did this great kick," or I remember you did this, and you think, "I can't even remember doing that," because you're so caught up in the moment.
It's all a bit of a blur. Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of your MMA career, then, Rosie, how would you you sum it up in terms of what was the best titles you won or the best experience that you had for certainly in the MMA circuit?
So I think, every fight I had was an experience in its own right. So I remember them all slightly differently for different reasons. It's very hard to pick out, this was my favourite fight, or it's because there are so many different experiences there across that time. I mean, overall, I won more than I lost, which is nice. I think, one of the ones that stands out for obvious reasons was my first UFC fight, because, all the time when I'd been involved in mixed martial arts, I can remember so many people saying to me, "Oh, women are never going to fight in the UFC." It was almost taken as read at one point. Even Dana White said, "Women are never going to fight in the UFC." Yeah.
Look at Ronda. Is it Ronda? What was the surname?
Ronda Rousey. Yeah.
She's amazing.
So, I always thought that they probably would, but I didn't think it was going to be within my career. So I didn't think, even when that first UFC fight happened, I didn't think I would ever be there, because, it wasn't my weight class. I wasn't ranked at 135. So it was, I hadn't really thought that was an option. And yet, a few months later, one thing or another, there I am. And so it was a roller coaster. It was a real whirlwind. And that whole experience was, it was very challenging in some ways. There are a lot of points when I suppose mentally that was really tough. But when I got there, and again, it was all quite surreal. So you're seeing this whole setup, and all the things about the UFC that I've been watching all the way through my career. There were fighters there. I'm on a warm-up mat, and you've got Dan Henderson.
Yeah. Who else? Do you remember who else was on the card?
It was Henderson, Rashad Evans.
Okay, yeah.
Headliner.
He came. Rashad Evans came through the Ultimate fighting program, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right. And
so 1 minute you're watching your idols or some of these top MMA UFC fighters. The next minute you're on the mat warming up with them. That must have been absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and it was, like I said, the whole thing was quite surreal, because it felt like, what am I doing here? I think it was one of those, because the sport grew up around me. When I first got involved in mixed martial arts, it was a tiny sort of niche within a niche. It was this tiny corner of the martial arts world. And again, when I first got into martial arts, it was actually quite a nerdy thing to be doing. You know what I mean when I say martial arts nerd, because that's absolutely what I was.
Me and Gavin growing up, we were nerdy kids looking at martial arts magazines, combat. People didn't really get us because we did martial arts and not football or rugby.
Exactly that, exactly. And sort of going from that into mixed martial arts, which was sort of another corner of the martial arts world at that point. And like I say, over the next decade and a half, the sport exploded, and it was almost just surfing that wave. Really, it was something that I never expected when I got into it, and then all of a sudden you look and you go, "Shit, what am I doing here?" So I think it sort of gave me a platform and a profile that I never expected to have. And again, sort of being one of the first women involved in that scene, and one of the first women to fight in the UFC, that was somewhere like I said, I just hadn't expected that. So it was quite an odd feeling fighting on that card.
What UFC number fight was it? Just so
it was 161, and I fought Alexis Davis, which is.
Presumably it'll be available to watch somewhere. I'm sure we can.
I think it's on Fight Pass and various. Yeah, you can find it. Yes, that was one of my better performances, I think. Again, especially if you look at where Alexis Davis was going into that fight, I didn't quite get the nod from the judges. I think I still watch that back sometimes and think.
Let me just see if my sources are correct. 29-8, 29-7, 29-28. Sorry, 29-28. 29-27 and then 29-28.
Yeah.
Very close.
So what happened after that then, Rosie? Did you retire shortly after that, and then, or did you what sort of date did you look at retiring?
So I had a couple more fights after that. I mean, the thing is, I'd seriously considered retiring before the call from the UFC came along. So I was actually, at that point, I was thinking, well, there's other things that I want to do. I had lots of other plans. And the trouble with competing mixed martial arts at that level is you really can't do anything else.
Yeah.
It's got to be an all-consuming thing. Because to compete at that level, the top people, it's all they do. So
that's your profession.
Yeah, exactly. It's not something you can do, or certainly it's very hard to do that alongside something else. I know there are people who make it work, but it's really tough. And so I'd already been looking at saying, you know what, I think it might be about time to call it a day. Then the UFC came along, and obviously I would be crazy to turn that down. It's like, we got to go for this. And we did. And I put everything into that for a year. After that experience, I think I wanted to have one more fight. I had one more fight back on Cage Warriors again. And it sort of felt like coming home. It was, it's back where I started out. So I ended up fighting Joanna. I can never say her surname. I will stumble over this.
Yeah, okay, that's all right. Yeah, no problem. So you have one more fight.
I think. But yes, no, I ended up fighting her. And again, nobody really knew who she was at that point. She was coming in undefeated, which is, again...
Isling there?
Aisling Daly. That was... Yeah, I thought that was in 2012, I think. So that was before the UFC came along.
Okay.
And there's a whole bunch... I mean, Roxanne Modafferi, I fought in, I think it was 2012 or 2011, maybe. I mean, she's still around now. She's still in the UFC. So, a lot of these names are people who've been around the block a few times. But yeah, my last fight was against Joanna. And obviously, as we now know, she went on to become the UFC's 115 champion for a while. Yeah. So yeah, and at that point, it sort of felt like a good idea. It felt like a good time to call it a day. So I had lots of other things that I wanted to do and wanted to get involved in, and which kind of brings me on to where I am now.
Because, you're stealing our questions here.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, I'm
get back to the script.
I'm certainly interested to hear about your climbing activities, because
okay.
You're into climbing. And I recently, I don't know if you've seen it, but I watched the Dawn Wall a few weeks ago.
Oh wow, I haven't seen that yet, but I've heard. Yeah,
in terms of motivation, it absolutely blew me away.
I
don't know. Obviously, it's Kevin somebody. I think one of the chaps, and Tommy. I forget their surname, but when you look at their journey And when there was on that wall for like weeks, and I think it took this. I think it was Kevin. I forget his surname. It took him about a week to get past this one part of the wall.
Yeah.
His fingers were bleeding as he hadn't eaten properly, hadn't slept properly. It was just so determined to do it. And when he finally did it, it was just an unbelievable moment for him.
Yeah.
And even watching, you could feel the emotion just watching the show. So, I mean, tell us a little bit about your climbing career then, and what got you.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't call it a career exactly. I mean, I climb. I am not an especially good climber. There are lots of people who are much better than I am. So it's something that I got into sort of around the time I retired from mixed martial arts, actually. I just wanted something a bit different. And again, I suppose in some ways you miss that adrenaline buzz.
Yeah.
And
next challenge, fill the time.
For me, I mean, obviously it's very different. The challenges are very different. Again, it's another way of, I suppose, challenging myself and getting that adrenaline buzz.
I think that's a normal thing, though. I mean, when you're used to being in that environment where you're full of adrenaline and full of fear and everything else, once you retire, it's like, well, what do I do now? And there's again a common theme with a lot of the people we've interviewed where thinking, well, I'm out of Tae Kwon Do, I'm out of karate, I'm out of MMA. What am I going to do now? And people are going to things like climbing and CrossFit and running and just different things where they're challenging themselves again, but maybe in a totally different way, really.
Yeah.
That is key for myself. When I left the military, I'd been involved in Iraq and Afghanistan on several occasions. And I came back out, got into Tae Kwon Do, got into the international team. So that was a great adrenaline boost again. And then when I decided to retire from that, it was, what's my next challenge? So I stuck myself through university. Totally different challenge, but probably even harder than doing anything on the mat or actually fighting. So I think a lot of athletes, a lot of sports people need those challenges in their life.
Yeah, absolutely.
From their main sport.
Well, you're goal driven, aren't you? Most athletes are goal driven. And I think
as you rightly point out, there's lots of different ways of getting that, and there's lots of different things where you can experience that sense of achievement, and going after whether that's going to university or doing a different sport or a different activity. There's it's not that there's a right way or a wrong way of going about it. I think it's just you're looking for something that works for you. So again, climbing was something that came along, and it was something that I decided to have a go at. So like I say, I'm nowhere near at the level of these guys you see in the films or anything like that. That's a whole other world from where I was. I think in martial arts terms, I'm maybe a green belt. At best.
Though, isn't it? Like you say, it's the individual personal challenge. To get from where in MMA to that level at rock climbing, it will take a lifetime, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So talk to us then a little bit about your political career, because obviously you've been elected into the Green Party as the councillor for Shirley West.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this was my next challenge, and again it was another one of those that sort of came along by accident almost. I've been a member of the local Green Party, but just not been particularly active. It's something that I've long believed in, but I was always too busy with other things to really get involved. But, as it happened, I think they came and hunted us down. No, I got to know a few people who were involved, and it turned out they were looking for a target candidate for this particular ward. And it's like, we think we can win this, but we need a good candidate. Sure. And I just happened to be there. So again, it's one of those things that I sort of said yes to and then thought about later. And I have a habit of doing this.
It's not always a bad thing. We were talking to a guest earlier this morning, and his bit of advice for himself is not to overthink things and jump in a little bit quicker rather than overthinking everything and never actually going to do it. So sometimes jumping in and then thinking, okay, how am I going to do this?
This is it, because I think if I thought about a lot of these things beforehand, I wouldn't do it. I mean, it's like my first MMA fight, If I'd had time to properly think about that, I might have done the sensible thing and said no.
Yeah. But who would take an MMA fight
Yeah. I mean, like I say, I look back on it now and I go, that was absolutely nuts. But, you know, and in the same way, you know, I sort of jumped into this because somebody said, do you want to have a go? And I'll say that's been a whole other world. You know, I've had I was elected back in May, and I mean, the learning curve has just been like that. You know, it's, but at the same time, I'm really enjoying it. You know, it's been absolute education, and there's so many things that a lot of the time you just don't think about, you know, the way things work around you, the way, you know, society works, that suddenly you start having to think about and go, how does that happen? You know, how do, I mean, things like, you know, everything from bin collections and pothole repairs to school admissions, social care for the elderly, public health, all of these things that you know, they're services that are just there that you don't really think about, and sort of seeing what's involved in making those things happen. As I say, I've been finding it fascinating.
Granted, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we do take so much for granted in our society. We just expect it to happen. As when you start thinking about all of the things that are involved in making that happen, you kind of go, crikey, that's there's a lot more to it than I realised. Certainly, I'm not going to, you know, about anyone else, but yeah, no, I certainly took a lot for granted. So I've been learning about that and trying to figure out how to make a difference, which again becomes a challenge, because it's very easy to sit there and say, this isn't good enough and that's not good enough and we should do better here. But then when somebody sort of hands you that position, it's like, go on then, make a difference. And you've got to go
examine all the underlying issues and challenges behind that. And tackle some of the challenges.
I mean, it's the difference between being in a fight and sort of all the, you know, that sort of sense of chaos and, you know, trying to make something happen or make something work, and in the heat of the moment trying to do the right thing, and sitting on your sofa watching a fight on TV with your big hand and going, why is he not doing that? You know, he's rubbish. Yeah. Why doesn't he just punch him in the head? And
it's never as easy, is it? It's never as easy as one would think.
And I think, you know, you get the real exact same thing with politics, you know, because I mean, I did it for years. You know, you sit on the outside looking in going, this is terrible. Why is it like this? Why are they not doing that?
Well, dare I say it, the B word? You know what I mean? I don't know if I should be talking about this. But
we try to avoid that.
But again, this is something, isn't it, where people get into it thinking they can make a difference and they can make it right, and the realities are there's so much stuff happening in the background that's never going to happen. You know what I mean?
I mean, it's like I say, it's the challenges there, and when you get involved, and as I say, when somebody hands you that position where you can make something of a difference and says, go on then, do it, and you suddenly realise that actually this is really hard work. This is
the frustration. It must be so frustrating for people in those sort of positions, you know, really wanting to make that difference and not having their hands tied, you know.
It's funny because then you know, when you see on social media people sort of talking about, or I mean, when I was out canvassing even, and people would talk about politicians, say, "Oh, don't trust any politicians, and they're all the same," and then you're going, "Hang on a sec, give me a chance. I've only just got into this," and you sort of see how people perceive it from the outside, I think
it's hard to change, isn't it? It's going to be very difficult to change people's perception, especially given the sort of chaos that we're in at the moment.
But as I say, it's something that's very easy to do, and it's a trap that I've fallen into as well. You know, looking at people, it's that them and us. You know, you look at people who are in there doing it, and it's very easy to see the things that you think they should be doing differently. But when you're on the other side of it, and as I say, I always go back to that fight analogy because I think it's a very good one. That when you're in there, it's, I mean, when I'd watch my own fight videos back, I'd look at it and go, oh, that's rubbish, I should be doing this, and you know, I could do so much better than this. When you're in there, it's different. You know, it's different.
I do like these analogies that you're coming out with. Certainly the belt one. You know, you said about in terms of climbing, you're probably at a green belt, because that's something that I certainly try and do in my life. I see things as belt standards from like a white to a black. I was saying to Jackson, I mean, we came quite crazy idea and said, Jackie, should we do a podcast? And we're like, well, we've never done a podcast before. We've got no idea what we're doing.
Let's get a book and do it.
Yeah, so we did a little course. We bought some microphones and we said, okay, well, we're probably at about a yellow belt now in terms of but even as podcasters, which we're now trying to improve the things that we do week in, week out with different guests. We're trying different things. We're trying to improve the way we are and trying to better ourselves again. It becomes you put yourself out your comfort zone again and do something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
okay.
I definitely say you've definitely moved on from yellow belt.
Okay, good.
That's good news.
I like that. Okay, look, green tag.
So, obviously, Rosie, you are an extremely motivated woman. Okay, from your educational side of your life growing up through to your martial arts to what you're doing now in your work life and also in your political life. What motivates you? What's motivating you? What's driving you on to continuously challenge yourself?
I think the things that have motivated me have changed over the years, and what motivates me now isn't what motivated me back when I was a teenager. Sure. So, and I think that's a normal progression as well. I think we all have things, and it's very, very normal for that to change over the course of a lifespan. And I think expecting to feel the same way about things in your 40s as you did as a teenager, that's unrealistic. So rather than talk about, how do you stay motivated? I remember at one stage, there was a time in my life when I wanted to be the best at everything. And I wanted to, I think it was almost feeling that I needed to prove myself in order to be worthwhile. I needed to prove that I was not only good at everything, but I was, up there amongst the best. And I think that was, it drove me to do a lot, but it was also incredibly stressful. I think nowadays I've sort of reframed that perspective, and I'm much more interested in what I can do to help other people. Yeah. And I think that's something that has just evolved over time, really. I still like to be the best at things. I still like to have a focus on having a really high standard in what I do. But I think the underlying motivation is more about how can I give something back? Because I know that I've had a lot of advantages along the way. A lot of people have helped me out. There's a lot of opportunities that I've had that not everyone gets. So I think having benefited from all of that, I feel like I want to make a difference. It sounds like a bit of a cliche, but it's sort of one of the most rewarding things in my line of work. And we haven't talked about this yet, actually. But these days, I mostly spend my time putting people back together rather than breaking them. So I'm an osteopath. I work with a lot of combat sports athletes. And so it's that whole Mr. Miyagi thing that I've got going on, the fighting and the healing. And so I spend a lot of time, I work with general population as well, but for obvious reasons, I think a lot of the combat sports folks tend to seek me out because I understand what they do and
the types of injuries
the types of injuries they get, and also how important it is to them to get back to doing that, and sort of trying to figure out how we can do that. What stresses their body's going to be under with that sport. So that's something that that's what my day job. That's what I'll be doing when I finish talking to you, that's something that I found exceptionally rewarding, because there's something about it when you get somebody who walks in, they're in pain, they're depressed because they can't do the thing that gives their life meaning, I suppose, if you like, to in a lot of cases, and they're feeling really down about it, they don't know what to do, and maybe their doctors told them to give up in the sport, and they come in and I can help get them out of pain, get them moving around, give them a pathway to get back to what they want to do. Explain how we're going to do this, how it's going to work, give them that level of understanding, and get them understanding their body better. There's something incredibly rewarding about that. And, when somebody walks out and they've got a smile on their face because they've got that hope, I suppose, that, things are going to get better.
Hope, Rosie, but let's go right back to the beginning. So you're a black belt in Tae Kwon Do, you're a black belt in jujutsu, you've had MMA fights, you've had UFC fights, you're a climber, you're an osteopath. What's next? A politician? What's next for Rosi Sexton? Our big project at the moment is we've got a website, combatsportsclinic.net. Okay. So I'm trying to put out some good sports injury advice and resources for people across all combat sports. We've done a lot for grapplers and MMA fighters. We've just brought out a new product for strikers, we will be bringing out in the next week or two. So keep an eye, watch this space. Strikers with shoulder issues. So the idea is, there's so much information available on the internet. You can find anything you want on the internet. The difficulty is always knowing what's good information and what's not so good, because there's also a lot of bad information out there, and you can end up going down the rabbit hole and finding loads of stuff, but you've still no idea whether this is reliable or not. So the idea with Combat Sports Clinic is we wanted to put up a site where we had reliable information from somebody, from people who've experienced, who know the sport, who've been there, who've done it, who know the stresses that the body's under, and who also understand the sports injury angle, and can, because I work with combat sports athletes day in, day out, I've got a lot of experience in terms of getting them back to what they want to do. So being able to sort of share some of that perspective and give some general evidence-based advice that people can use to help themselves, that's something that I really wanted to get into, because again, it's a way of helping more people, and I can only treat so many people in person, but via the dark magic of the internet, you can obviously lots more people. Of course. I mean, we'll certainly we'll get all that information off you, Rosie, so we can put it on our Facebook group, and obviously we'll try and help you promote that good cause. Really
fantastic.
So well done for that. So
excellent.
I suppose have you got any final questions, Jackson? Anything else to add, or before we wrap this interview up? I suppose.
Who do you think we should interview next? Who would you like to hear on our podcast? Once you get listening to them, of course.
There's a question.
Dana White.
Never been a particular fan of Dana. His style doesn't really sit well with me. I know he's done a lot of things for MMA and things like that, but on a personal level, in terms of who you get on, Dan Hardy's always a good one, but I know that he's got a lot of calls on his time. He's got a lot of his out there. I'm just trying to think who's
not necessarily an MMA fighter, any traditional martial artist or motivation,
or even climbing. Anything to do with motivation. I think,
Okay. Well, tell you what, I'll have to have a think, and I'll maybe see if I can send you some suggestions. So I'm struggling off the top of my head, but I will. If anyone occurs to me, I'll send them your way.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you, Rosie.
Great to speak to you. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode of the Motivated Martial Artist podcast. Don't forget to check out our Facebook page and our Facebook group, the Motivated Martial Artist podcast.
And don't forget also the Motivated Martial Artist Instagram page.
So head along for some extra content, interviews, and much more.
So until next week, it's bye from Jackson
and Gavin,
the Motivated Martial Artists.